kingdom stretched wide, but for one man, the world felt painfully small. On the edge of its borders, far from the bustling towns and rich markets, lived a herdsman whose name few remembered and fewer cared to speak. His home was a crooked hut of mud and straw, crouched against the wind as if even the walls carried the weariness of survival. He owned little, almost nothing. Only a handful of goats grazed on the brittle grass that clung stubbornly to the dry soil. These animals were not just livestock. They were his lifeline, his companions, his last defense against hunger. Each bleating sound was both comfort and reminder. His survival balanced on a thin edge. The days were harsh. The sun beat mercilessly on his back as he guided the goats across rocky hills. When rain came, it came too heavy, washing away what little grew. More often the sky was empty, offering only dust and thirst. Hunger gnawed at him like a wolf that never slept. His ribs pressed against his skin, his hands rough and cracked from labor. Yet he carried on, one step after another, driven not by wealth or dreams of grandeur, but by a stubborn refusal to surrender. In the nearby villages, he was known but not respected. The wealthier men mocked him openly. Children whispered, pointing to his torn cloak and bare feet. Merchants turned their backs when he entered the market, knowing he had no coin to trade. He endured the scorn quietly, his head bowed, but his spirit clung to something no poverty could steal: kindness. For kindness was all he had left to give. At night, when the goats huddled close for warmth, he would sit alone by the fading fire. His eyes would linger on the stars, searching the heavens for answers, for comfort, for the faces he would never see again. For famine had taken more than food from him. It had taken his family. His wife's laughter, silenced. His children's small hands, gone from his grasp. Disease had swept through their frail bodies like a storm through dry grass, leaving him with memories and silence. The grief pressed heavy on him, yet he refused to let it harden his heart. Even in loss, he whispered prayers for those who suffered worse. Even in loneliness, he shared what little he had with strangers who crossed his path. Some thought him foolish. "A man with nothing cannot afford to give," the villagers said. But he did not listen. For deep in his soul, he believed that kindness was the last true wealth a man could hold. Still, doubts haunted him. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the cold bit deepest, he wondered if hope was only a cruel trick. He wondered if his prayers were carried by the wind into nothingness. Yet when the sun rose, he rose too. He tied his goats, lifted his staff, and faced another day. The villagers laughed. "Why smile, herdsman? You own nothing." But he smiled anyway, not because life was easy, but because he feared that if he stopped smiling, sorrow would consume him entirely. Every step of his life was a balance between despair and hope, between hunger and survival, between loneliness and memory. He bore it all with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose, and yet, in his heart, everything to give. And so, the days passed, harsh and unforgiving. The goats grew thin. The man grew weary. Yet still he endured. Still he hoped. Still he waited. Little did he know that fate was already moving, drawing near, that the cracks in his suffering would soon give way to something he could never imagine, that in the ashes of his hardship, a stranger would arrive, one who would test his heart, and in doing so, change the destiny of a kingdom. The sun was sinking low, bleeding red and gold across the sky. When the herdsman guided his tired goats back toward his hut, dust clung to his feet, and the ache of another hungry day weighed on his body. He had nothing waiting for him but a small fire and the faint hope that tomorrow might be kinder. But that evening, the silence of the hills was broken. From the horizon, a figure appeared, small at first, a shadow against the dying light. The herdsman stopped, leaning on his staff, and watched as the figure drew closer. It was a man, cloaked in worn fabric, the hood pulled low over his face. His steps were slow, dragging, as though every stride cost him dearly. When at last he came near, the herdsman saw the truth. The traveler was exhausted, his clothes torn, his skin marked by dust and sun. His hands trembled, and his eyes, though half hidden, carried a weight that spoke of long roads and heavy burdens. His lips were dry, cracked with thirst. The herdsman's heart tightened. He knew the look of a man pushed to his limit. Hunger, thirst, loneliness, these were pains he himself had walked with every day. The stranger spoke little. His voice was low, rough like stone against stone. "Please, water! A place to rest." The herdsman's eyes fell to the goats huddled nearby. They were thin, barely enough to keep him alive. His stomach groaned at the thought of parting with even one, for he knew the cost. To give away what little he had was to invite deeper hunger, perhaps even death. And yet, he looked again at the stranger, a man alone, desperate, with no roof, no bread, no friend. The herdsman drew a deep breath and nodded. "Come," he said softly. "My home is poor, but you will not sleep in the cold." He led the stranger to his crooked hut. The fire was small, the air heavy with smoke, but it was shelter. The herdsman offered him water first, precious drops saved in a clay jar. The traveler drank, relief shuddering through his body. But water was not enough. The stranger's hollow eyes searched the hut, and the herdsman felt the sharpness of his choice. He turned toward the goats, his last treasure, his only food. He hesitated. His hands shook as he untied the rope from around one goat's neck. It was the strongest of the few that remained, the one he had hoped would bring milk for many weeks to come. The herdsman closed his eyes. His heart broke at the thought of losing it. But still he whispered, "Better my hunger than another man's death." That night, the goat was cooked over the fire. The smell of the meat filled the small hut, rich and warm. Yet the herdsman himself ate little. He pushed most of the meal toward the stranger, watching as the man ate with quiet gratitude. The stranger lifted his gaze once, and in that moment, the herdsman felt something strange. The man's eyes, though weary, held a depth that unsettled him. They seemed too calm, too knowing, as though they saw beyond the walls, beyond the night, beyond the herdsman's simple life. When the meal was done, the traveler spoke a blessing over the food. His words were soft, but they carried a weight, as though spoken not only to the herdsman, but to the very air, the very stars above. The herdsman listened in silence, his heart stirred by something he could not name. He did not know it yet, but this act of sacrifice, this moment of choosing another's life above his own survival, would be the seed of a miracle. For the stranger who sat across from him was no ordinary man, and the night ahead would change everything. The hut grew quiet after the meal. The fire crackled softly, casting faint shadows across the walls. The stranger lay resting on the floor, his breathing steady now, while the herdsman sat near the doorway, staring into the night. His stomach ached with hunger, but strangely, his heart felt lighter than it had in many years. He had given away his last goat, his last chance at survival, and yet there was no bitterness in him. A quiet peace filled his chest, as if the stars themselves had poured comfort into his soul. Leaning back against the rough wooden post, he lifted his eyes to the heavens. The sky was clear, alive with stars that glittered like scattered fire. He whispered a prayer, his voice trembling. "God of the heavens, if my suffering is to last forever, then give me strength to endure it. If hope still lives, let me see it before I die. And if nothing else, let my kindness not be in vain." The night answered in silence, Yet deep inside him, something stirred. His eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted into a restless sleep beneath the stars. That was when the visions began. First came the sound of rushing water. He dreamed of rivers bursting forth from dry earth, their waves sparkling with golden light. The barren fields he had known were suddenly alive with grain, tall and heavy, bending in the wind. He walked among them in wonder, the air thick with the smell of harvest. Then the ground trembled beneath his feet. Mountains shifted, rising higher, their peaks crowned with fire and cloud. The sky split open, and a voice, deep, commanding, yet tender, spoke into the marrow of his bones. You gave when you had nothing. You opened your hand when others would close it. What you have sown in hunger, you shall reap in abundance. What you lost in despair, you shall gain in hope. Awake, herdsman, for your life will never be the same. He gasped in his dream, falling to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the words. Tears streamed down his face, though he did not understand why. Then came a light, bright, endless, filling his vision until all else was gone. He felt warmth, as if the universe itself had wrapped him in an embrace. And then, silence. The herdsman awoke with a start, his body trembling, the early chill of dawn brushing against his skin. He sat up quickly, his eyes darting around the hut. At first, he thought the dream had left him. But then he froze. The hut was not the same. The cracked walls of mud and straw were gone. In their place rose a great tent, tall and shining, its fabric rich and embroidered with golden patterns. The floor beneath him was soft, layered with woven rugs. Outside, he heard not the thin bleating of a few goats, but the thunderous chorus of thousands. He stumbled outside, his legs weak. His eyes widened, his mouth falling open. The barren fields were gone. In their place stretched endless green pastures, rivers flowing where once there had been only dust. His goats, multiplied beyond counting, covered the hills like waves of life. The herdsman fell to his knees, his hands pressed to the earth as tears streamed down his face. His heart pounded with awe and fear, wonder and disbelief. This cannot be, he whispered, trembling. What has happened to me? Yet even as he spoke, he knew. The voice from his dream echoed in his mind. What you have sown in hunger, you shall reap in abundance. The poor herdsman who had given his last goat to a stranger had awoken to a miracle, and his life, once marked by sorrow and emptiness, had stepped into a destiny beyond anything he could have imagined. The day of transformation had come. The morning sun rose like fire over the hills, and the herdsman stood frozen in its light, still trying to believe what his eyes told him. Only yesterday, his world had been dust, hunger, and ridicule. Today, rivers shimmered where there had been cracks of dry soil. Fields rolled with green abundance. His goats, once a handful, now blanketed the land in thousands, their bleating a chorus of life. He touched the earth, still trembling, half fearing it was a dream that might dissolve if he blinked. But the soil was rich, the grass soft, the air full of the scent of harvest. His hut, once a sagging skeleton of mud and straw, was now a magnificent tent, tall and shimmering with colors he had never seen before. Villagers from nearby soon noticed the change. At first they came cautiously, whispering rumors as they walked the road. Some believed a sorcerer had moved into the valley. Others thought the gods had taken pity on the poor man. When they saw him, their mouths fell open. The same herdsman they had mocked, the same man they had laughed at in the market, now stood clothed in fine garments that had appeared as if woven by heaven itself. His goats filled the horizon. His tent stood like the dwelling of a ruler. Many bowed, others stumbled to their knees in awe. Some, overcome with guilt, could not meet his eyes. The herdsman himself was overwhelmed, his heart beat with both wonder and fear. He had prayed for strength, but never for riches. He had asked for hope, but never for power. And then, as if to answer the storm within him, the stranger returned. He did not appear in rags this time. The cloak of dust and weariness was gone. Instead, he shone with a quiet radiance, his clothes gleaming like the garments of a king, his posture tall and commanding. His eyes, calm and deep, fixed on the herdsman. The herdsman fell to his knees, trembling. "Who are you?" he whispered. The stranger smiled gently. "I am a messenger, sent not to take, but to give. I came to test your heart. You gave your last goat, your last hope, to a stranger you did not know. You chose compassion over survival. And so, abundance has been placed in your hands." The herdsman shook his head, struggling to breathe. "I am not worthy. I do not know how to rule. I am only a man who tends goats." "Then remember this," the stranger said. "The kingdom given to you is not meant for pride, but for service. If you rule as you gave, selflessly, humbly, your land will flourish. But if greed takes root, if pride consumes you, all of this will crumble into dust." With those words, the stranger vanished, leaving the herdsman alone once more, but not as the man he had been. In the days that followed, the weight of his new life pressed upon him. People came from all corners of the kingdom. Poor beggars seeking food, merchants seeking trade, lords and rulers seeking alliances. They bowed, they praised, they begged, and the herdsman, now surrounded by riches, felt a fear growing inside him. The voices of the villagers still echoed in his mind, their laughter, their scorn. Would he now become like them, mocking, greedy, careless with the weak? Each night he walked the fields, watching the rivers and the goats, feeling the burden of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He remembered the faces of his wife and children, lost to famine, and wondered if his choices now could save others from such pain. But with wealth came temptation. Courtiers whispered in his ear. Traders offered bribes. Envious rulers sent gifts wrapped in threats. His people adored him. Yet they also demanded from him, pulling at his generosity like hands tearing cloth. The herdsman's heart wavered. Was he truly strong enough to carry this gift? And yet, even in doubt, he held on to the lesson of that night. The power of giving when nothing remained. The poor herdsman had awoken to a kingdom. But he knew this truth. This was no reward. It was a test that had only just begun. Wealth had come like a flood, and with it, power. But wealth and power are not gentle teachers. They test, they twist, they tempt. The herdsman, now no longer mocked but revered, sat in the great tent that had risen from nothing. His goats multiplied across the hills. His land stretched far beyond what he could walk in a day. Villagers called him Lord. Travelers called him Master. And even lords from distant provinces sent letters sealed in wax, asking for friendship. Yet behind the bows and praises, envy grew. The kings of neighboring lands whispered of him in their courts. "Who is this man," they asked, "that rises from nothing, yet holds more wealth than we?" Merchants feared losing their trade. Lords feared losing their authority. And many who once scorned him now sought ways to tear him down. It began with small things. A border lord sent men to steal goats under the cover of night. A wealthy merchant spread lies that the herdsman used witchcraft to gain his fortune. Soon, threats arrived, subtle at first, then open. The herdsman found himself caught in storms of politics, betrayal, and greed he had never known before. But the greatest struggle was not outside. It was inside. At times he felt his heart harden. When he looked at his wealth, at the gold now stored in his tents, pride whispered in his ear, "You deserve this. You suffered long enough. Now take your share of joy. When people knelt before him, he felt the strange temptation of power, to believe their reverence, to forget the days when he was the one bowed low by hunger. But then he would walk among the poor who came to him, hollow-eyed and desperate, mothers with starving children, farmers ruined by drought, beggars with trembling hands. Their suffering struck him like a knife, for he saw himself in every one of them. He remembered the night he had given his last goat, the ache in his stomach, the fire of sacrifice, and how it had opened the door to this miracle. And so he chose, instead of hoarding his riches, he built. He ordered great storehouses, granaries filled with grain to feed the hungry. Wells were dug in dry lands, bringing water where none had flowed. Schools were raised so that even the children of the poorest could learn to read and write. The villagers, once cruel, now sang his praises. They said, "This ruler is not like the others. He remembers us. He cares for us." But goodness never goes unchallenged. Jealous rulers gathered in secret. "He makes us look small," they spat. "His kindness steals our power. If we do not crush him, soon all will follow him." They plotted war. They bribed his own men with promises of silver. And within his kingdom betrayal crept close. Trusted servants began to whisper of greed, taking what was not theirs, twisting his generosity into corruption. The herdsman felt the weight of it all. At night, sleep fled from him. He sat awake, haunted by fear. He had once been a poor man with nothing to lose. Now he was a ruler with everything at risk. He prayed again, as he had prayed when he was poor. "God of the heavens, am I worthy of this? Did you give me riches to raise me high, only to let me fall? I am only a herdsman. I do not know how to rule." In his heart, he heard no voice this time, only silence. Yet even in the silence, he remembered the stranger's warning. "Rule as you gave, selflessly, humbly, and your land will flourish." That memory became his compass. When lords demanded taxes, he lowered them for the poor. When enemies threatened war, he sought peace before swords. When his own men betrayed him, he punished with justice, but not with cruelty. Still, doubt never left him. He feared that at any moment pride might take him, or greed might undo him, or his enemies might destroy all he had built. But the people loved him. His kingdom prospered not in gold, but in hope, and word spread far and wide that there was a ruler unlike any other, a man who once had nothing, who gave all, and who now led with a heart uncorrupted. Yet fate was not finished with him, for every trial of leadership was but a shadow of the final test yet to come, a test that would reveal, once and for all, whether the herdsman was truly chosen to rule, or only a beggar raised too high. Seasons turned, and the herdsman king's name spread like fire across the land. Farmers prospered, trade flourished, and the poor found shelter in his care. He was loved deeply, but also envied more fiercely than ever before. Whispers grew into storms. Neighboring kings, bound by greed and fear, gathered armies on the borders. They declared him a fraud, a beggar who had bewitched the people with lies of kindness. They vowed to burn his fields, scatter his goats, and erase his name forever. The herdsman knew war was coming. On the eve of battle, his advisers urged him to strike first. "Send your armies," they cried. "Show them you are no weak shepherd, but a true ruler. Crush them before they crush you." But deep within, he trembled. His heart returned to the memory of the stranger, the night when sacrifice had opened the gates of destiny. Was he to forget that lesson now, when the cost was greatest? That night, alone in his tent, he prayed until his knees ached. He begged for a sign, for the voice of the one who had once spoken to him. Silence stretched long, heavy as stone. Then, like a whisper in the wind, a memory returned. "What you gave to the least, you gave to heaven." What you withhold in fear, you lose forever. The next morning, as drums of war thundered on the horizon, the herdsman made a decision that stunned his generals. He did not march with armies. He did not sharpen swords. Instead, he clothed himself in the plain garments of a shepherd, the same rags he had once worn when mocked by the villagers, and walked alone to the border. The enemies laughed when they saw him. Their kings jeered. "Is this your mighty ruler? A beggar in rags? He comes not with armies, but with empty hands." But the herdsman did not answer their scorn. Standing before the vast host, he raised his voice, not as a king commanding power, but as a shepherd speaking truth. "You seek my land, my goats, my gold. But these are not mine. They are gifts, entrusted to me. If you desire them, then take them. But know this, wealth is ash in the mouth of the greedy. What endures is not what you seize, but what you give." His words cut sharper than swords. The soldiers murmured among themselves. They saw not a king trembling with fear, but a man unbroken, unchained by pride or possession. And then it happened. The sky darkened. A storm unlike any other split the heavens. Thunder rolled, the earth shook, and a figure appeared, radiant, terrible, and familiar. The stranger, clothed in light, his voice boomed like the sea. "This is the test, not the riches you gained, not the crown you wear, but whether you would still choose sacrifice when all is threatened. You gave once when you had nothing. Today you give again when you have everything. And so you are found faithful." The enemies fell to the ground in terror. Their kings trembled, unable to raise sword or spear. The storm shattered their pride, scattering them like dust. One by one, they fled, leaving behind banners, weapons, and fear. The herdsman stood, drenched in rain, but unbowed. His people rushed to him, tears streaming down their faces. "You saved us without lifting a sword," they cried. "You have shown us a power greater than armies, the power of sacrifice." But the herdsman wept, not in weakness, but in awe, for he had faced his greatest trial, the temptation to cling to power, to defend what was his by force. Instead, he had chosen the path of surrender, and in doing so had become stronger than any king of earth. That day marked him forever. No longer just a shepherd, no longer just a ruler, he was now a symbol of hope. His kingdom was not built on gold, nor goats, nor armies, but on a heart that remembered what it meant to give. And so the herdsman passed the final test, not by victory in battle, but by triumph of spirit. Seasons passed, and the storm of war faded into memory. The herdsman's kingdom, once mocked as a shepherd's dream, became a living testimony of compassion's power. No walls of stone guarded his land, yet no enemy dared return. The fields stretched wide with golden grain, wells brimmed with fresh water, and schools filled with laughter of children who once starved in silence. Where greed had once ruled, generosity now blossomed. Travelers from distant lands spoke of it in awe. "Here is a kingdom where the hungry are fed before the king eats, where widows are not forgotten, and strangers are welcomed as kin. The poor no longer begged, the sick no longer suffered alone, and in every marketplace, in every home, the people whispered the same truth. It was not goats or gold that built this kingdom, it was kindness." The herdsman king walked among his people as one of them. He never sat high on a jeweled throne, but chose instead to sit under the shade of a tree, listening to the stories of farmers, widows, and children. His crown was plain, his robe simple, yet to the people he was the greatest of kings, not because of his wealth, but because of his heart. And then, one quiet evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the stranger appeared one last time. He was no longer cloaked in mystery, nor shining with thunderous light, but gentle and familiar, like a friend returning home. The herdsman, now gray with years, looked into his eyes and felt once more the warmth he had felt on the night he gave his last goat. "Why have you come again?" the herdsman asked, his voice trembling. The stranger smiled. "To bless what has been completed. You have passed every test, not by power, not by cunning, but by holding fast to kindness when all else pressed you to let go." He laid his hand on the herdsman's shoulder and spoke words that would echo forever. "Greatness does not belong to those who take when they have much. It belongs to those who give when they have nothing left." In that moment, the herdsman's eyes filled with tears. He thought of the night he was hungry and alone, yet chose to feed a stranger. He thought of the battles he did not fight, the riches he did not hoard, and the mercy he did not withhold. All of it, every sacrifice, every act of kindness, had led to this truth. The stranger departed, fading into the last light of day. The herdsman watched until the horizon swallowed him, then bowed his head in peace. Years later, when the herdsman's body was laid to rest, the people wept, not in despair, but in gratitude. They carved no grand statues, built no towering monuments. Instead, they carried forward his legacy in the way he had lived, feeding the hungry, sheltering the poor, welcoming the stranger. And so, his kingdom endured, not as a realm of stone or steel, but as a living kingdom of kindness, passed from heart to heart, generation to generation. The story of the poor shepherd who gave his last goat to a stranger became more than legend. It became a truth written in the soul of the people, that the smallest act of sacrifice, born of love, could change the fate of a kingdom. And though the herdsman was gone, his spirit remained, guiding, blessing, and reminding them all of the eternal promise that true greatness lies not in what you keep, but in what you give.